Welcome, everyone, to the AFA's first discussion of race in the finance profession. I'm Heather Shooks from Yale, and I have a wonderful group of panelists with me today who I'll introduce in a moment. But first, a couple of housekeeping items. If you have not already filled out the AFA Affect Climate Survey, please do so. It will help us shed light actually on a lot of issues that we'll discuss today. Second, as you know, this is a webinar. And so the way to engage with the panelists is via the Q&A feature. I will monitor it during the course of our discussion, and we've carved out at least half of the session for open discussion and Q&A. So please do submit as we go along. I'll try to get to as many of those as possible. I'd like to introduce our panelists. We have Laura Field, who is the Donald J. Puglisi Professor of Finance and Finance Department Chair at the University of Delaware. Laura has recent research on race in the corporate boardroom. She's also a member of the AFA's new task force on race. In addition, she's spent a lot of time mentoring undergraduates, some from underrepresented minority groups over the course of her career. And I should say that instead of spending time working through kind of the long distinguished CVs of our panelists, I'd like to focus briefly, at least, on what brings them here today. Second, we have Peter Henry, who is Dean Emeritus and William R. Buckley Professor of Economics and Finance at NYU Stern. Peter spent years working to improve diversity within economics, so brings insights to our discussion today. He's the founder of PhD Excellence, a pipeline initiative that targets high potential undergraduates of color and works with them through both mentoring and training. Andrew Karolyi is the Harold Bierman Jr. Distinguished Professor of Management, Deputy Dean and College Dean of Academic Affairs at Cornell's S.C. Johnson School of Business. Andrew has a long history of involvement with the PhD project and is launching an exciting new joint PhD project and AFA initiative. Pietro Veronesi is the Chicago Board of Trade Professor of Finance and Economics at Chicago Booth. He's also Deputy Dean for faculty there. He has launched PreDoc, which is a new consortium of universities working to attract students of color to PreDoc positions. Finally, Rohan Williamson is Vice Provost for Education, Professor of Finance, and Bolton Sullivan and Thomas A. Dean Chair of International Business at the McDonough School at Georgetown. Rohan is the chair of the AFA's new task force on race. So welcome to all of you. I thought that to kind of frame our discussion, I could start with some data. So I think at this point, most of you are aware of the underrepresentation of minority groups within academia, within STEM and economics specifically. A recent Journal of Economics Perspectives paper by Ibanya Washington, Amanda Baer, and Gary Hoover report that 9.5% of economics PhDs awarded to US residents were awarded to faculty of color. And you should compare that to the population share of about 30%. So significant underrepresentation. How do we stand within finance? I think if we were in a crowded conference room, I'd ask all of you to just take a look around and estimate that percentage among our colleagues. And the number is relatively low, but to shed light on it, I'm going to share with you some data from the PhD project, which is focused on increasing representation among business school faculty. So as a benchmark, this is data from the AACSB that shows that about 7% of all faculty at US business schools are Native American, Black, or Latinx. And only a small fraction of them are from finance. Most of them are in management and accounting. These are the raw numbers And I put these up to show that those raw numbers are quite small. They've been increasing over the last decade or so, but these data from the PhD project show that underrepresented faculty account for, as of last year, about 169 faculty positions. Now, how big is that relative to our profession? Actually, calculating that is non-trivial because we don't have a lot of data. But I did some back of the envelope calculations to give us a sense of what fraction of the finance profession these numbers represent. So what I did, and I have estimated here in red, I took from some data from the PhD project, AFA membership data, and data from a recent survey that my Effect colleagues and I have just completed. And I estimated AFA membership. So what fraction of AFA members are underrepresented minority faculty? This assumes that all of those PhD project faculty are AFA members. If you take that, then a reasonable range might be somewhere between, for last year, between 3.6 and 6.5%. So what's the right denominator? The dark red line here shows an estimate of underrepresented faculty, an estimate of all faculty who are AFA members. And the dotted line is an estimate of US faculty who are AFA members. And so these are rough estimates. It's not clear that all, for example, 169 underrepresented minority faculty last year are AFA members. But what this shows is that relative to economics, where the latest number from the Committee on the Status of Economic Groups of minority groups within the economics profession suggests that 7.1% of faculty are faculty from these underrepresented groups. The number in finance are low. And they're low relative to the number of faculty in underrepresented groups at business schools. So however you slice it, there's certainly underrepresentation. I want to leave you with another, I think, really striking aspect of the data, and that's as we look to the future, we can ask ourselves, what does the pipeline look like? And here, the PhD project has tracked the pipeline of new underrepresented faculty, that is PhD students, over time. And what you see here is that from the late 1990s, there was an increase driven mainly by increases in Black PhD students. But as of about 2007, we've seen significant declines, driven mainly, again, by Black PhD students, but also an absence of Native American groups. So what's driving these patterns? On the supply side, on the demand side, what can we do about it? Lots to discuss here today. And so I'm going to turn to my panelists to shed some light on those patterns. I'd like to start with you, Andrew. You've spent many years with the PhD project and perhaps can give us some context, especially behind that first slide.
Thanks, Heather. Good afternoon, everybody. Good morning. It's wonderful to be here. Really pleased to join you, Pietro, Peter, Laura, Rohan, the audience on this really important discussion, especially given the facts that you've shared and the launch of this really important AFA task force that you, Laura, and Rohan are, of which you are all three important leaders. My job on the panel, as you said, is to talk about this distinguished history of the PhD project. It's a really innovative pipeline initiative that started with the KPMG Foundation, GMAC, the AACSB International. It was targeted in the early 1990s. 1994 was the launch for Black, African American, Latinx, Hispanic American, and Native Americans to promote them into the Business School Academy. The original mission statement of the launch was, quote, to increase workplace diversity by increasing the diversity of business school faculty, all designed to encourage, mentor, support and enhance the preparation of academic leaders. I was fortunate to attend the 25th Gala in Chicago. It's a little over a year ago, pre-pandemic. Many of the now, 1,600 plus URM business school professors in the US were together celebrating how much progress has really happened. We celebrated the influence of the founding director, Bernie Milano, who has now stepped down. A number of my AFA members may know of him or have met him and his important contributions. They talked a lot about the 90% PhD completion rate of those students that come through the PhD project. They talked a lot about the 97% ascension to faculty positions that they've talked about in their placement records. And they even featured very prominently the dozens of tenured faculty who have now pivoted into careers in administration as deans of US business schools. And a lot of time was spent at that gala recognizing the many individual as well as institutional sponsors. These are the funding sources for the PhD project, including Fidelity, Thrivent Financial, American Express, New York Life, Lincoln Financial. Those are the current prominent financial sponsors. Now, serendipitously, I think it's I'm sure it's actually right around 1999 in what were the PhD project's early years. I was serving as the PhD director at Ohio State in the Fisher College of Business there. And through an acquaintance who I won't name, but she knows who she is, she got me actively involved in the Finance Doctoral Student Association's annual program. It was at that time still affiliated with the FMA. The program of the FDSA, this is the finance track of the PhD project, is a sidecar one typically to a major meeting like the FMA, to which the PhD program students are flown out and they're supported to attend both. These are the primary uses of the funds. The program involved a number of PhD student presentations, critiqued by PhD program member faculty as mentors, very upbeat, positive, constructive, along with a bunch of professional development workshops on career progression, the job market, paper writing, journal submission strategies, dealing with R&Rs, and so much more. So I was involved in some of those workshop sessions, and honestly, I loved it. As a now, quote, non-member friend of the PhD project, I think that's my official title, they kept asking me back, and I kept coming back. And my favorite part of the programs were the annual dinners that would be associated with graduation ceremonies in which we celebrated those among the members who have completed their qualifying exams, have passed their proposal defenses, gotten their first academic jobs, reached tenure, and so on. Again, very positive, upbeat, encouraging. And of course, I noted a number of other regulars, non-member friends, other non-member friends of the PhD project who would regularly attend these sessions. Now, even back in the early 2000s, I remember meeting with the leaders of the FDSA group, as well as the PhD project executives. And they were worried about the waning numbers of students who were engaging in the finance track. And I think, like you saw in Heather's charts just a minute ago, the numbers are quite stark. They are low, growing slowly compared to some of the other disciplines, specifically management, marketing, and accounting. And I remember a lot of discussions around the tables, even in unstructured sessions, sort of hypothesizing as to why that is the case. And one idea was proposed that the affiliation with the FMA may not have been ideal. Sure, great for the job market seekers in the PhD project pipeline, as it was, but not so great for the pre-market PhD students who simply couldn't get away mid-semester. So following a lot of discussion, in 2003, they decided to switch the affiliation and make the sidecar program together with the WFAs in June. And now, unfortunately, the synergies with the WFA program that they had hoped for did not come to pass. It wasn't an interference with mid-semester, obviously, being in June, but the numbers continued to drift downwards, and you saw those numbers that Heather just shared, all the way up until a couple of years ago. And in 2019, they decided again to switch, this time to affiliate with the AFAs, the ASSA meetings. And the hope here was that the synergies with the economics track of the ASSA, right, the economics track of the PhD project, would really help boost membership and engagement with AEA and AFA faculty. Now, to be honest, last year in San Diego wasn't great for a bunch of reasons, but this year's much better. And I'm going to give a little shout out and credit to Ken Singleton, John Graham, Laura Starks, key members of the AFA executive. They decided that they were going to try to strengthen the link with the PhD project with a new initiative. They asked me to step up as an unofficial ambassador, friend ambassador, to launch this mentorship program. And the idea of it is trying to identify willing PhD project students who could be matched to AFA members as mentors of their choosing or recommendation in a way that would be like a booster charge to their respective research programs. Not a substitute for their own thesis advisors in their schools, of course, and we made that point clear, but rather a complement. And I volunteered this year as the matchmaker in chief, I guess. And we reached out to a number of senior colleagues in the business, working with these students, trying to find the right match. And what was striking was just how only too willing those who we reached out to were to participate in this opening gambit initiative. So gratifying actually to see this dedication. It makes me feel optimistic that we can make some inroads in the coming years. And just in case you're wondering, it's not just the AFA that's stepping up. This past year, the WFA executive, yeah, I'm past president, we agreed to sponsor a new travel grant program to encourage PhD students from the PhD project to join. Keep that link, because I think that's important. And the FMA last year, a number of people on my panel have been involved, launched a new annual Diversity Emerging Scholars Initiative, nicknamed DESI, D-E-S-I. I was happy to be part of that as well, and as well as with other friends of the project. So I think I'll stop there, Heather, and I think that gives you a really broad brush history or picture of the past, and I'm sure we'll talk more about it with some of the other colleagues on the call. So thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you, Andrew. Now, I think we'll turn to Peter, who brings us perspective from economics. Economics has been kind of organized and working on these issues for decades now. So Peter, maybe we can turn to you.
Thank you, Heather. And please cut me off when I've hit my time limit here. So wanted to sort of build on what both Heather and Andrew have said by just providing a little context about economics. Economics, as you know, is a key tributary to, if you will, kind of the finance pool of talent. And so it's important just to understand the role that economics plays in this story. And as Heather said, the role of the American Economics Association in trying to get more underrepresented minorities, African American and Latinx folks in particular, into the economics profession dates back to the early 1970s. And frankly, the data today in terms of the number of PhD, and here's the key point. In order to increase the number of folks who are actually on faculty, you've got to increase the number of people who are getting PhDs, okay? And so in the early 1970s, the numbers were something like roughly between 4 and 5% of newly minted PhDs in economics were going to African-American PhD students. So the latest data that I have are from 2017. So in the year 2017, there were 468 total economics PhDs awarded in the United States. Of those, 15 went to African-American students. All right, so that's 3.2%. So if you think about the problem that we're trying to solve, that Heather's framed so nicely for us, it's just a non-starter to increase the representation of faculty if 3.2% of your newly minted PhDs are African-American, right? You're just not going to get there. And so one of the things that I've been most involved in is an initiative called the PhD Excellence Initiative, which is a Sloan Foundation funded initiative that I started in 2013 to come at this problem from a slightly different perspective. So we obviously need scale here, but the working assumption of the PhD Excellence Initiative is if we can just increase the number of African-American Latinx PhD students by a small amount every year, right? In other words, if we increase the pipeline by 2 or 3 students every year who have pretty potentially high success rate, that's a major delta on 15 students. Okay, and so the working hypothesis of the PhD Excellence Initiative is to show that it can be done at a very high level, and then let scale follow from the delivery of excellence. So what have we done? So I really like you to sort of folks to take away 3 things from what I'm going to say. Right. Number one, this can be done, but it takes a long time, but it can be done. And I'm going to give you some data on that. 2, it's not cheap to do this. Okay, so basically, the cost per student to do this, you should think of this as basically, it costs what it takes to fund a PhD student per year. And that's not surprising because basically what we're talking about here, and I'll say a bit more about this, is allowing people to invest in their human capital to make up essentially a human capital gap in their lifetime human capital accumulation. And then the third thing I'll say is that, and I want to be very blunt about this, mentoring is not for everybody. So there's an opportunity cost involved in mentoring. And if you're serious about actually giving students what they need to be successful, first of all, as applicants to get into PhD programs and then successful in the PhD programs, there's a trade-off, and it's called faculty time. All right, so with that, let me just talk about what we've done. So the PhD Excellence Initiative, and I encourage all of you who are out there, whether you're faculty or current graduate students, anybody in the audience who has access to students of color or Latinx students, URMs broadly speaking, please encourage them to apply to the PhD Excellence Initiative. Our deadline for application is February 1st. So what is the PhD Excellence Initiative? The PhD Excellence Initiative is a post-baccalaureate program that looks for, number one, students who've completed a BA or in the process of completing a BA who demonstrate intellectual curiosity and grit. Because those are the 2 most fundamental characteristics, I think, that really predict your ability to complete a PhD. And so we screen students for that very strongly. And then we basically bring them to NYU to work with me as research assistants for 2 years. And very importantly, one of the things that we've learned throughout the process is that research often takes a backseat to just baseline preparation. So what do I mean by that? One of the reasons why I think the numbers in finance and economics are so low relative to management and other fields, whether it's in the PhD project or just more broadly, is because we know the mathematical requirements for economics and finance are much higher. And that's a major barrier to entry. And frankly, it's a barrier to entry for US students generally, not just underrepresented minorities. I mean, we know, one of the kind of the dirty secrets of the economics profession is that most economics undergraduate programs don't train US undergraduates in economics sufficiently in mathematics to go on to get a PhD in economics. So when you think about the filter of how URMs come into the world of economics, it's not surprising that there's a fleetingly small fraction of URM students who have the mathematical and technical training just to sort of clear the bar to be plausible candidates for a PhD in economics. So the PhD Excellence Initiative often puts research on the back burner and says, okay, you've got the grit, you've got intellectual curiosity. We're going to give you the blocking and tackling training in mathematics. Importantly, we're going to set aside the time for you to take courses to make sure that you're prepared to get a PhD. And so what we often find is that students actually need to spend the primary part of those 2 years just acquiring basic math skills that they need to be successful. And if that means they do more of that than basically helping me with my research, so be it. So that's kind of the fundamental working premise of our program, is that the goal is to get students into PhD programs, and we do whatever's required in order to make that happen. So that's sort of, without going into too many details, that's sort of the broad approach. I will say though that we've had some real success in doing this. So since 2017, we've placed 5 African American students, 4 of whom are women, into top PhD programs in economics or public policy. Duke, Minnesota, Columbia, and this past fall, Brown and MIT. So this can absolutely be done, but it takes a real investment in what I would call basic training. And to sort of connect that to the point I made about mentoring not being for everybody, in order to make that happen, you often have to basically, again, put your own research and your students' involvement in getting your own research projects done on the back burner. Because, at the end of the day, you just can't get into a graduate program in economics unless you've completed, the equivalent of real analysis, linear algebra, and differential equations. And so no matter how much research experience you've had. So it's not that research experience isn't important, and then also, frankly, the GRE is a hurdle for a lot of students, right? And so we actively put aside big chunks of time for students to prepare for the GRE, because here's the thing. The GRE, like anything else, you can be prepared for. So there's just some very fundamental things that, and this is why, to point number 2, this is why it's not cheap, right? Because if you think about, again, sort of the funneling process by which students come to the point where they're going to apply for a PhD. So it starts with, you begin at a US undergraduate program. And if you just think about the pool of people who come into US undergraduate institutions, right? We know, I mean, just from the data in economics, which I'm not an expert in, on sort of, just call it sort of, educational attainment. We know there's an achievement gap. There's an achievement gap because there are income gaps and all sorts of disadvantages that underrepresented minorities face from the time they're born in this country. And so it's not surprising that over the course of their lifetime, on average, they've accumulated less human capital. That's not a surprise, right? But so the working assumption, right, is that you're sort of looking to find what I would call sort of unidentified fixed effects in individuals who have grit and creativity, who could, if you gave them a chance to make up the gap in accumulated human capital, be just as good, if not better, than your typical applicant into a PhD program. And so that's why it's not cheap. So basically what the PhD Excellence Initiative does is give students 2 years of essentially the environment of being in graduate school, but we allow them to focus on GRE prep and math prep. And I think the results are speaking for themselves, but from a kind of institutional perspective, this is not cheap. It costs a lot of money because it's basically the cost of living and the cost of taking classes for 2 years. So that's what we do. But this has been working. We're happy about it. The way in which we try to scale the small program is we partner with, for instance, the New York Fed. We have a summer research workshop every summer. It's sponsored by the New York Fed, to which we invite underrepresented minority and also traditional, sort of represented, if you will, group faculty to participate in our summer research workshop. And we sort of created a network of both current PhD students, recently minted PhD students, these are now all underrepresented minorities, and current PhD Excellence Initiative fellows, so that there's a community, right, of underrepresented minority scholars. And our hope is that we will, out of this, continue to develop future mentors at other institutions who will be willing to do this. And we hope the Sloan Foundation will fund this broader scale initiative. So maybe I should pause there, Heather.
This is great. Thank you, Peter. And we'll certainly return to all of this during our discussion. I know Peter talked a lot just now about mentoring. And I know, Laura, you've been doing quite a lot of that over the years. I know you also have many thoughts on the issues that we've laid out here. So maybe I'll turn to you.
Okay. So I'm going to start by saying I experienced a lot of the things Peter's talking about personally. When I first went to UCLA, I grew up in a lower income area. My parents didn't go to college. I didn't know anybody in college. I got there and I felt so out of my depth. When I was in high school, I was the top of my class. I got the highest SAT score. I got to UCLA. I went into calculus and realized I don't know what they're doing here. I'd never had pre-calc. And even though I'd taken all the math that had been available to me, I couldn't keep up and I really struggled. And I went for a couple of years and then I decided, I need to take a break. And I decided I could make more money working because I'd learned a skill while I was in college. So I went and worked for a few years. And over that time period, I learned more about, how to apply myself, and I realized I didn't have the tools I needed. So I went back, and while I was working, took pre-calculus and took a bunch of classes, then went back full time and went from a 2.8 GPA to a 3.98 GPA, just from having the right background and learning how to study. But I had to teach myself all of that. And this is where I think what Peter's talking about is great. And I will add that the issues are yes, underrepresented minorities, but even first generation and students who come from lower income backgrounds, generally, I think it's an issue. So I'm going to talk about a couple things that I prepared that I wanted to follow up with Peter because that is very personal with me and I've lived that and I know what he's talking about. And when I compare me to my kids are doing great. They don't need all this. And I didn't purposely set out to set them up, but they're set up and it's just part of how they grew up, which I didn't grow up like that. And a lot of kids from underrepresented groups and also first generation, they don't grow up with it just being ingrained in your psyche. You have to learn and you need somebody to help you. And so I think that's where we can come in. And so I had actually prepared some stuff, but I'm going to skip because I wanted to talk about Heather wanted me to talk a little bit about my research, but I wanted to talk a little bit more about the pipeline stuff. So I served as the PhD coordinator at Penn State for 10 years, and it was difficult to find applicants of color. And when we did, it was difficult to recruit them because the demand far exceeded the supply. So it's not that we don't want to admit students of color, it's that it's very hard to find them. And when you find ones that are good enough, there's so few, everybody wants them. So there's several issues with regard to recruiting PhD students that I want to touch on. One major problem with identifying diverse students is that many of them don't realize that being a professor is an amazing occupation, nor do they consider that they could actually do this as a career. So as I mentioned, I'm a first generation college graduate in my family, and my family still doesn't understand what I do. It's really hard for them to understand what I do for a living. And so I think if we want to attract students from underrepresented populations, we have to find them early and mentor them so that they know this is a career option. And more importantly, and this gets to Peter's point, that they're adequately prepared to apply to a PhD program. Most undergrads don't know what it takes to get into a finance PhD program. And so I've been a department chair at the University of Delaware for almost 5 years now. And as department chair, I've realized that universities actually have searchable databases of student characteristics. I just found this out this fall. I'm starting to use these resources myself to reach out to students of color as well as first gen college students. And I'm trying to form relationships with them early on, even before they're technically taking finance courses. So I also want to talk about a recent experience I've had that really opened up my eyes to needing to be more proactive in these areas. So because of COVID and our students being forced to take courses remotely, this fall I decided to set up small groups for freshmen and connecting them with student mentors, upperclassmen. Since I haven't been teaching undergrads, since I've been department chair, I had to ask our faculty and our academic advisor for input as to potential upper class mentors that I could use. So once I got the list together, I started to put students into groups and pairing them with mentors. And after working on this for a few days, it occurred to me that I didn't have even one mentor from an underrepresented population. I didn't even have one student of color, and it hadn't dawned on me. And that's when I realized, oh my God, I'm Hispanic and I didn't even think about this. And that's when I realized we need to be more aware and more proactive to make sure we're connecting with these populations. So that's when I learned that the university had the searchable database where I could look for students of color. So I used the database for the first time this fall, and I was specifically able to look for upper class students of color who had good grades and could serve as mentors. Not only did I realize we had several from which I could choose, but I realized they were excited to be part of the program, and some of them actually needed the money. And these students just hadn't connected with the faculty in a way that they stood out, and the faculty didn't think of them. But those students are there, they're doing well, but they don't know. I tell my kids all the time, go get to know your faculty. Students of color and students who come from families where you don't go to college, they don't know they're supposed to reach out to their faculty or that their faculty are there to help them. And I think we need to reach out to them. And that's kind of, what I want to make sure we do. So, by relying on the recommendations from my faculty and the academic advisors, I didn't identify these students. So this personified to me one issue we need to be aware of, and that's that students of color who have lots of potential are not necessarily visible to us. And so we have to be proactive in finding them. And I think if we find them early, we can have a hugely positive influence on their lives. And if many of us did this, we could improve the pipeline into our profession. And I want to also be clear that I feel like if you reach out to any of these kids, and even if you don't get them into a PhD program, just connecting with them and showing them, you can have such a great life, one that they could never, I'm living a life I could never dream of. I never thought this would be, it's so amazing to have this career and have this life. And I just fell into it. But, to have somebody help and pull you up, and you change future generations forever. My kids are very different from it's not something, like I said, I did on purpose. It just, the things that they've been exposed to, and it makes all the world of difference. So one last thing I want to talk about was, Heather wanted me to mention that I've done a little bit of research on race. So I recently worked on a paper that examines race and gender on corporate boards and on board leadership in particular. Although I was aware that people of color were underrepresented in the boardroom, it wasn't until I worked on this paper that I understood how pervasive this is. So although we've seen steady increases in female representation on boards in recent years, there's not been the same growth in representation for directors of color. So our paper looked at leadership roles in the board, and we found that diverse directors, and by diverse, I mean female and directors of color, they're significantly less likely to serve in board leadership roles. And by that, I mean the chairman, lead director, or committee chair, despite the fact that these directors are highly qualified. In every dimension we looked at, they were highly qualified. But what surprised me most was, while these discrepancies do seem to be declining over time for women directors, they're particularly strong and quite pervasive for directors of color. So last month, I attended a practitioner conference of institutional investors. I was the only academic there, and they were talking about a lack of racial diversity on corporate boards. One of the points they discussed was pressuring firms to add diverse directors to the nominating committee, which I found particularly interesting because our research, we tried to look at ways, what can firms do to improve this? And we found that firms that had a diverse director on the nominating committee were more likely to put diverse directors in leadership roles on their boards. And so because I'd done research on this, I was able to share my results with these institutional investors. And so the point I want to make is that the institutional investors were quite interested in board diversity, really focused on it. And particularly they're interested in issues of race. And I think it's an area where our research can have a real impact. So I think those are the two main things I want to say. And from a personal perspective, I really think, we have these kids in our programs. We just need to find them and reach out to them and encourage them.
Great, thank you, Laura. Rohan, I will turn to you. You are chairing the new AFA task force on race. So in addition to kind of what individual faculty can do, we'd love to hear your thoughts on what the AFA as an institution can do around these issues as well.
Okay, thanks, Heather, and thank you for leading this discussion. I think the AFA is focusing on a very important issue. And again, thank you for doing this. I think this is great. And just to give a sense, I kind of look around and despite everyone here, I'm very much connected with. And even in terms of the our task force that we have. And if you don't know, Andrew was on my committee, and so I have to at Ohio State. So he's been engaged for a long time. And on the task force, Heather didn't mention when she opened, but she's also a member of our task force, including Laura, Gustavo Grulion, and also Ken Singleton, who reached out to engage the AFA in these very important issues. And just to connect things too, as when I talked to Ken about it, we talked about Peter's program, what he's doing, because again, Peter and I had discussed this a few years ago, and I think he's doing a fantastic job with his initiative. And I know Andrew's engaged with the PhD project, and Pietro, that he'll talk at some point today. I see that he's doing a great job there with the pre-doc program. But just to give a sense of what we're trying to do, and my background is in some ways very similar to Laura's. I mean, the difference, I was an engineer, so I got the math training, but I know how to do that part of it, but I didn't have an economics background, so I had to kind of pick that up along the way. And like I said, Andrew helped in that stuff as well. But what we're thinking about, so what are the problems here? One of our charges is, okay, what do we need to do as an organization to come up with basic solutions, right? And if you look at the issue that we hear all the time, where there are no candidates, there's a pipeline issue. There's not enough here. We really want to do it, we want to hire, but there's not enough. And AFAC is doing a great job, and they probably hear that too when it comes to gender diversity. And so we think about there's a pipeline issue, and why is that? Why is that happening? And the PhD project that Andrew talked about, the DESI program, is later in what I call the funnel. It's sort of later on after the fact. And so, but the key here, and Peter just hit the nail on the head, that there's so few that imagine if there were two or three more candidates of color on the job market this year. That would be a tremendous increase from what it was last year, and it would be a significant delta to us out there right now. So that's so we're talking about small numbers, but with a great impact on what we have currently. So we thought about this and said, how do we want to approach this problem? Because what's happened, and how do you decide to get a PhD? I mean, and know in my case and in others, you kind of, well, someone tells you about it. It's not something that comes up natural unless you're, Laura pointed out with her children, with mine, they kind of understand all these career opportunities now. But when I was coming through, and for instance, a lot of my family members were in the medical field, so I didn't want to do that. And so I didn't know anything about it. And at some point, in fact, the person that introduced was an operations professor. Wow, you have a really good aptitude for it. Have you considered getting a PhD? I said, why would I want to be a teacher? And you kind of went through the process. Didn't think anything about research. It's kind of, I don't want to do that. Teachers don't get paid that much. I'm okay right now. And after kind of looking further, he sat down and had a conversation. I said, wow, this would be a great career to have. So it's all information based, and this is all information that I got later on. It wasn't an undergrad. I graduated, I was working, and we met, became friends, and we played tennis together. And so this kind of went into our thinking, and how do we get there? And sometimes you make the decision later in life, you probably can't make it because you're on a particular path, and you don't have the information. So let's think about, when do we provide the information? When you get exposed to this? Was, as Peter mentioned earlier, one of those things is getting the information early and preparing yourself. So information, preparing yourself for this career. And so so when should this happen? as early as possible, right? Because once you've graduated and you're working or you're in an MBA program, it's kind of late for some. And when you talk to others, they always think about, well, I have student loans and I can't afford it, not knowing that, well, you don't have to pay for it. In fact, the money flows in the other direction. So we went through these discussions over and over again and said, how can we deal with this? Because, you know, the try to hit a large group, the percentages are going to be low and they're going to be few, but again, a few will make a large impact. And we knew of the PhD program, that was later on. And we knew Pietro would talk a bit more about the pre-doc program, but we said, let's try to get earlier in the funnel. Let's think about it earlier by, first of all, providing information, right? And so in similar, we kind of copied some of the things that that AFEC is working on in dealing with gender diversity, is think about, well, how can we get the information out? Well, let's start really early. Let's even connect with the AEA type programs and expose them to financial economics as a way as a future opportunity. So so thinking about it at an earlier point where freshmen, sophomores, engaging students to say you must have strong quantitative skills. Think about econ courses, stats courses, and math courses, and be able to prepare yourself. And then that increases those students that are the exposure of students and preparing them from an academic standpoint. And Peter pointed out the point quite well, that a lot of students of color, the preparation in high school is not, that doesn't prepare them for a PhD career. So they have to, if they know about it earlier on, perhaps they can engage in those particular courses as an undergraduate. And then through the AFA and through creating so a go-to website, for instance, for them to say, okay, what are the opportunities out there and what can be offered? One thing in joining with the AEA, potentially, they have a month-long program that around, and so engage those students and say, we can motivate those students at an early point in their career to think about this as a possibility. As they think about things, if they think about finance careers where they want to be investment bank or other things, may think about things this as a career. Laura mentioned it. This is a great career. It's a great life. It pays well, and if that's the motivator, then think about it that way, and then the impact that one could make through the research. As Laura talks about board diversity, I have a few friends that are in hires for boards, and that's one of the things they talk about is, you know, the diversity on the boards of directors and being able to achieve that, and how can that happen. So I think, and if you look at her research, what potential students can do in dealing with this problem, I think is quite important. So our approach is create the information, engage with the students early with the appropriate background to prepare them to start thinking about it. Because again, Peter, if you think about Peter, is much more focused, but we can think more of a broader context to increase those that are more interested. Another connection is going to be, we talked a lot about mentors. As I said, in my case, someone mentioned this to me, I would have never thought about it. And if I had a question, I know to give him a call and say, hey, how does this work? Point me in the right direction. And so another thought process here is have a list of faculty members. And this is not the deep mentoring that Peter will do, but these are going to be undergrads. They have a questions. Well, why don't you call Professor Carolli, for instance, and he can talk to you for 10 to 15 minutes. And it could be a student at Cornell, or it could be a student at some other university. It may not be a Cornell student, maybe a student at Ohio State as an undergraduate, and create a list of those that they can connect with. And perhaps they can have a discussion of what's the life, what do I need to do, what courses should I take? And this is not a tremendous time commitment, because again, they're not in a sense asking for research assistance, but more of basic questions about the field, and potentially help to point them in the right direction. What can I do? Who else can I talk with? It addresses the issue that Laura brought up, in that we don't have mentors, but these are going to be academic mentors, and also encourage our current faculty to reach out, pay attention to those students that may potentially have the aptitude or the desire to get into PhD program, and then point them to say, hey, go to this website that will teach you more, and then we can engage some programs. the broad part of this issue is not, there's no magic bullet. There's not, if we do this thing, all of this goes away. Like any other societal issue or concern or anything else for that matter, the magic solution is probably not there, right? Or it's going to take a long time for us to figure it out. But it's going to take efforts by a lot of people, a lot of from a lot of directions. And what we're thinking about is deal with the pipeline issue. Andrew's thinking about research success. Pietro is going to talk about preparation. Peter's a lot focused. We say, okay, now we can bring a longer list of potential candidates that we can think about. We can engage broadly our colleagues in the AFA to reach out and encourage other students, and then we can get more involved in the pipeline. I think that's the biggest issue, and to remove that as a reason or an excuse that may be given as to why we can't expect to expand more in that field. And the way I always think about, as Laura pointed out in her research, is corporate America is kind of identifying and thinking about this. It's not just, and it's not something that we say, it can't be fixed, and no one else is doing anything. I'm not sure if that's correct. I think corporate America is ahead of us on this one, in that they realize that there's a lot of value in having a diverse workforce and diversity in our research and what we would like to do. But I commend the AFA. I think this is a great initiative, and we just started several months ago. In a small group, we're coming up with a lot of great ideas and engaging, and this panel allows everyone to see different steps along the path, and we are trying to make sure that we complement one another and not compete with one another. And I think so far we're doing a good job. So I'll stop there and turn over to Pietro, and then we can come back and discuss more. Thank you, Heather.
Great, thank you, Rohan. So Pietro, you're working on taking a different approach to the pipeline, working on attracting underrepresented minorities into pre-doc programs. It would be great to hear from you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for inviting to be on this panel. Hi, everyone. So what is pre-doc is written behind me is the Pathways to Research and Doctoral Careers. This is a consortium of universities and research institutions that aims to foster a talented, diverse, and inclusive population in the social sciences. It's very young. It was just born this summer, and it's still very much growing. And the number of universities, research institutions, around 2022 at the moment. It's been keep growing quite steadily. And what is the main idea, going back to its point, is actually to leverage, in order to reach this goal of diversity on pre-doc positions. What are pre-doc positions? These are 2-year full-time, paid research assistantship positions that are becoming increasingly common in finance and economics. So for those of you who haven't really looked at the trend, in the last 5-6 years, we have seen a major shift in the way researchers do research in economics and finance. Right now, about 50%, many of the faculty now avail themselves of these research assistants that are full-time employees of the university and the school, and they work alongside researchers. And these are positions available in many universities, Chicago, Stanford, Princeton, NYU, MIT, many others, the Federal Reserve, of course, and many other organizations. And these are great positions to learn what is research in economics and business to start with. And our data, moreover, show that about 50% of PhD applicants to our current PhD programs actually do have a pre-doc experience before that. And that generates another vision. I'm going to go back to it in a second, but it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity because, going back to the pipeline, it's a feeder, so if 50% of PhD applicants have that experience, which is research related, then if we can increase diversity at that level, then automatically it's going to trickle up into PhD applications and solve a number of the frictions that we've been talking about. For instance, they would be working with top researchers in the world, so reference letters would be coming from people who have been very, already established researchers, as an example. And moreover, they get experience in doing that. So there is a logic to it. I will go back to it in a second. But as I said, this is very young. So what is Predoc? First of all, is a platform. Predoc.org is the website for those of you that want just to go and look it up. It's predoc.org, again, Pathways to Research and Doctoral Careers. It's essentially a platform that make demand and supply meet with each other. And so eliminate essentially the search frictions to find this position. Right before Predoc was born, in order for a student to find out about this position, they had to go website by website, first know about it, which was already a big deal, and then look for it in individual websites. Instead, what we did was to outreach ourselves to all the hiring institutions and encourage them to put their positions available on our platform, if you want, in our website, which is growing. Okay, we just was launched just in October, so it's only 3 months ago. And by many means, it was pretty successful. We had over 80 job postings already for something like 280 positions. 280 positions is a big number. You think about it, the number of researchers that could go and work with the top researchers in the country. And from the supply side, so how many students went to look at this position? We had over 13,000 visits with 8,000 unique visitors already. And remember, it was just born 3 months ago. So we are hoping that this trend will continue, and students will find their opportunities by going there. But that's only the first level, making sure that demand, eliminate the search friction that, if you think about, affects mostly one side of the population, exactly the people we've been talking to about, so first generations, underrepresented minorities, that their search frictions could be higher. They don't have the connection with current researchers. And if you put everything in a website, all the job postings are there, that is already a first step. But the second part is also to do a big outreach. We did a major outreach to all the hiring institutions and also all to the minority serving institutions, HBCUs, institutions with large URM population, like state schools, state universities, etc., in order to give information out. We ran a number of events at the local institutions where our own faculty from different schools of membership came in and gave presentation. What is research? What is being a professor? What are the salaries? Going back to the question, a lot of information out there. And then going forward, that's what we are developing at the moment, is to increase the educational content. Exactly for what has been just mentioned, which is we want to reach out to freshmen in college and tell them first all the beauty of research, what it is, and then provide them with information on what course you are supposed to take. Here are some maybe courses that you can find on Coursera as an example that don't cost much, but maybe they are not offering your college. Here is what you could do. Or what type of job opportunities come after the pre-doc. Yes, most people go to a PhD, which is our intention, of course, but 20-30% may decide they don't like research, and so they go back to the industry. And so, but the pre-doc experience, a couple of years, they allow students to acquire additional skill, like in computer sciences, data science. We train our own research assistants to learn additional skills, so that even if you don't go to the PhD, well, you can go back to the industry and, you're going to have a higher human capital, as was discussed before. So, we are all hoping that this is going to go to beef up the pipeline, but the overarching goal is essentially to increase the pool of PhDs of any background into pre-doc, and so later for PhDs, and increasing their skill. And information is one of the big frictions, and that's what we are trying to do. I'm mindful of time, so I can speak for 2 hours about this, but I will probably go back to it during the conversation if anybody has questions.
Great, thank you, Pietro. So now we're going to move to the kind of open discussion and Q&A part of our session. Please do submit any questions into the Q&A tool. I'll start with just kind of a basic broad question that any of you can take a stab at. And that's, we've talked about the underrepresentation that is pretty clear in the data and lots of work that's being done to try to tackle that. But in general, kind of why is this important? And related, kind of why is it urgent that we start tackling these problems now? So,
Heather, I'm happy to jump in.
Great.
I think Laura teed up the answer to this question really well by talking about her research on corporations. It's about value creation, right? I mean, if you think about it, corporations want more diverse employees and a more diverse board because the data demonstrate pretty conclusively that more diverse corporations are higher performing corporations. There's a lot of research that shows that. And so there's no reason to believe that our field is any different. Whether it's the research, right? Because it's not just that you want more diverse researchers in economics because they're going to work on issues related to diversity. They're going to bring a different life perspective to all questions in economics and therefore bring different insights. I mean, again, it's the point that Laura was making. When you approach a problem and you're a first generation student, the set of assumptions you bring to the data are very different than, frankly, the assumptions that I bring to questions, being the son of two people who had PhDs. That's a fact. I mean, it's like comparative advantage. We trade with other countries when other countries are different from us. Otherwise, it's not very interesting to trade with them, right? So this is really all about creating value, creating new perspectives on existing problems, and also bringing in new problems into the discussion.
If I may add, Peter, those are exactly great comments. In fact, I completely agree with those. It's the perspective and the background. I'm going to enrich our thinking about economics and finance. In addition, it's also a question of talent. One of my big worry is that anytime there is a selection, whether implicit, explicit, etc., you're leaving out talent. And if you want to, for us, as a welfare maximizing, we want to maximize the output and the quality of work, etc. You have to reach out to the broadest possible number of people with any possible background, because they will bring up their experience. I completely agree with this comment, actually.
Can I just jump in, Heather? Just to say, from the perspective of the academy, seeing faculty members of color standing in positions of authority, standing in front of the classroom can be so critically important guideposts for those who are students sitting in those seats. So from the perspective of the academy, a number of us on this call are involved in administrative roles. We really want to advance the diversity of our faculty to inspire our students with the kinds of stories that some like Laura has shared. Poor Laura, we're embarrassing her by talking about it, but she did it. She brought it out. And the fact is that more Lauras in front of the classrooms are critically important inspiration points for many of the students that are coming up, whatever field they aspire to. We really desperately need to inspire them, I think, and the diversifying the faculty that stand in these roles is a really important mechanism. And this is sort of a society at large kind of statement, I think.
Heather, can I just give some empirical evidence to back up Andy's statement?
Sure.
It's more anecdotal. I mean, one data point is not really it's data, but my own personal experience. As an undergraduate at the University of North Carolina, it never occurred to me to actually to do a PhD in economics. I said, I have two parents who are PhD, but they were in the natural sciences. Economics and finance generally are kind of this sort of interstitial field that is, it's very kind of quirky and that people don't really know about it unless you kind of come from that background. And Sandy Darity, William Darity Jr. was a professor in the economics department at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and African-American, said, you should apply to a PhD program in economics. Changed my life. To Andy's point.
That's useful. In fact, I'm the moderator, but Laura and I were talking about probably my favorite study that's kind of systematic evidence on this, at least in the gender kind of dimension of underrepresentation. This randomized control experiment by Carroll, Page, and West, where they look at differences in outcomes in STEM. For kind of female students that are randomly assigned to female instructors, and the high performing ones end up pursuing, in their case, more quantitative fields as a profession. So it seems that this kind of role of role models is one that is backed up, at least by the data, the larger sample data that we have. I want to move to a question that we have from the audience, and that's about kind of selecting candidates into PhD programs, and also selecting candidates as potential faculty. They're wondering about unconscious bias and whether that plays a role outside of this pipeline problem that we've discussed in the decision-making process.
Well, I mean, I'll take a shot at that one. I think absolutely it does. I think what happens that sometimes we tell ourselves that we have no biases whatsoever, but all of us do. I mean, everyone, we all have biases, and those biases absolutely play a role in the decisions we make to hire someone or to interview them. It's clear that, as I said, I was an engineer. And just as a background, my whole 4 years as an engineering student, I only had one other African American in any class over the 4 years, and I did not have an African American or female instructor in my engineering program. So it was, and I remember, this is a negative experience that morning to the class or whatever, one of the physics classes, and I went one day to see the instructor, and I just went. I was having a particular issue with electricity and magnetism, if you care what that is. And I asked him a question, and his response to me was, "I know this is really hard for you." And I walked away thinking, that was his first statement. I was, and so it was clearly an assumption that, I mean, and I could be interpreting things the wrong way, but I think there are these things that we have in our mind that things like women are not good at math and things like that we go and you carry that into an interview internally. And if someone asks you, you're going to say absolutely not. And I think that is an important component that as those that are making decisions, the hiring decisions, you have to very carefully train yourself not to do that, because some of it really does come natural. And we see incidents one after another in the US, for instance, of individuals reacting away and saying, hey, I don't have biases. I mean, racial issues, if we think about what is her name, Amy Cooper in Central Park and things like that, it sort of really happens. The hires happens in a hiring, in hiring as well. And that's not even to call someone racist or biased or anything like that, but I think all of us have it internally, and we have to consciously try to not let that be a part of our decision making and how we think about things. So if don't be ashamed of some of that in some ways, because everyone has it, but to be careful in dealing with it in an explicit way and be open to those that you're talking to and those that you're around. I think those are really important things. And I more recently, I was involved in a similar conversation. One of the comments that was made by one of the African Americans is that there's more racism happening when I'm not around than when I am. And I said, what do you mean? In discussions, as people are talking about things, that's when things sort of happens, and then it plays out. So it's and this is unconscious as it plays out, but it's there. And I think as individuals, we all need to deal with them directly and think about it as we're going through the decision making, whether it's race-based or gender-based, whatever it may be. We really have to be more deliberate in the positions that we're in.
Great. So I want to pivot a bit and maybe talk about something that Peter mentioned during his discussion. There are actually a couple of questions in the Q&A that ask about maybe math preparation and also somewhat disadvantage of U.S. students in general, not just underrepresented minorities in math. The question is, what should we do to start to change that?
I would like to pipe in a little bit here. I think it's a shame that as for our undergraduate finance majors, we don't require them to take much math. And I think that disadvantages us in terms of finding PhD students, because we get them as juniors. We say, hey, you're a great student. It would be great for you to get a PhD. How much math have you had? Well, that one math class you made me take. I think really we as a profession should think more about pushing our undergrads more toward more math. And I think if we did that, that would increase the pipeline of American students generally.
I agree wholeheartedly with that. And I also think, to build on what Laura was saying, and something Rohan said earlier, it's important to start doing this early. Math is a language. And, we can, there's a certain extent to which, and I think rightly so, economics and finance have been criticized by becoming too beholden to the math, because you can hide intellectual sort of depravity or vacuity behind the symbols, right? But that's another conversation. But there is a threshold of analytical understanding you need to be able to actually engage comfortably with the profession. And the sooner you can begin acquiring those language skills, the better off you are. So I think this is something that departments just should be thinking about more generally. I mean, what does it say about you as a department if the vast majority, and it is the vast majority of graduates in your discipline with BAs haven't taken courses that would qualify them to apply to your PhD program? That would seem to be a deficiency. I mean, this is not all schools, but I think a lot of schools find themselves in that position if they're honest.
If I can chime in on this one, because we thought about it a lot as we were working through pre-doc, if you don't mind. I think that it's not only math, it's the overall background that is very special when you do economics, finance, etc. It's certainly analytical, but there is a lot of data. One of the things that we notice is that even brilliant students coming from really different background, maybe engineers, then they want to apply to pre-doc position. Here is the data task. And they never use data, never actually analyze a huge data set. And that is the filter to, get even into a pre-doc position, as a given example. So, one of the aim is, in fact, to start education, going back to freshmen, I would say, and tell, the overall curriculum. It's not only mathematics, which is certainly important, but, take statistics, take econometrics, take something that have you look at the data. Also because, finance, is moving also in a direction where maybe the mathematical part is getting a little lower. I'm thinking about, the application of psychology to financial problems, etc. But data is always there, so we needed to deal with that one way or the other. I'm a theorist, so I tend to do more on the math side. But, there is so much data to consider, even if you end up doing other type of research that is less analytically oriented.
Heather, I think Pietro's making an excellent point. If I could build on that a little bit. So I think, one of the things we just have to be aware of that we're not creating another problem as we're trying to solve one problem. So the data threshold, I think rightly so, is becoming higher and higher. But if we're basically applying that filter now to people getting into pre-doc programs, right? We could inadvertently be creating, another screen that's basically, again, just sort of selecting people from, essentially privileged backgrounds. So this is not to say we should be having these pre-doc programs. I'm just saying we just need to think carefully about the fact that I think the kinds of programs that Pietro is talking about may serve a very important purpose, but it's a fairly different purpose from the kinds of hurdle issues that Laura was talking about, right? Because there may be. I'm gonna start to keep using Laura as an example here, Laura, but there may be other Laura fields out there, potential Laura fields, right? Who, at this point in time, could not pass Pietro's, data screen. But if given 2 years to build some basic skills, at the end of those 2 years, could pass that screen and then would be able to use those skills in a very new and interesting way. And so we need the programs that Pietro's running, but we also got to think very carefully to make sure we're not, to get into Pietro's point, we're not inadvertently leaving out talent, right?
Just
That's
adding.
what we're doing. Sorry to say, but it's exactly right. It's what we are doing. Sorry, Ron.
I'll let Rohan, but I'd love to jump in on this one too.
You can go ahead, Andrew. I had my turn the last time. Go ahead.
No, I just wanted to say, maybe a little bit provocative, but I wonder if, and I'll give you a context here. I wonder if we have met the enemy, and the enemy is us, in that we perhaps too often, when we are prescriptively interviewing or considering or meeting with candidates that might be potentially really viable candidates for the pipeline, the first thing that we ask them, as almost like pre-screen questions, was how many calculus or real analysis courses they have taken, as if that's like the entry ticket you need to punch before you ever get into this whole business. And I know it's our first instinct. It's like the easy heuristic. And it may be, in fact, to our great determinant. Let me offer one example, and then I'll pass. And this example comes from last November. In the PhD project, not only do we have these sidecar programs of the finance students that are affiliated with these programs that I described in my remarks, but they have their annual conference. And the annual conference is an open one across multiple disciplines. And what happens is different schools basically put up their booths. This year it was virtual. And you have a number of faculty members sitting behind the booth, and students drop by. Students drop by. These are students that have signed up for the conference, prospectively interested in pursuing a PhD. They don't know for sure or not. And what's really interesting about these conversations is, they're sitting there at these sort of bifurcation decision points in their careers. Usually they might be a junior, maybe a sophomore. They've been encouraged or found their way to register for this conference, to think about it even. And they're sitting there saying, well, yeah, I've got an undergraduate degree in finance from so-and-so university, and I'm interested in finance. But when they step up to the Cornell or the NYU Stern booth, the NYU booth, they're not actually sure. And I wonder, and this is a hypothesis that is not mine, but that of the senior executives at the PhD project, is that the numbers are taking off in management and marketing and information systems, even hardly non-technical fields, some of them, simply because they are much more welcoming in these early stages than we are ourselves. We are almost hurting ourselves by blocking them. Can you imagine somebody thinking about whether they're going to go into marketing or finance, and we ask them, so how many math courses have you taken? I said, well, I've only taken one course, the 2 courses in calc. Oh, well, maybe marketing is the way for you. This is something that we may need to do a little bit more introspection of ourselves and the way we approach these questions.
Andy, there's no question we have a cultural problem. That's in the data. I mean, it's the AEA did a really extensive survey, which, suggests that the cultural problems that they expose are not, a real analysis cultural problem per se, but it's highly the problems they expose are highly correlated with, frankly, a general arrogance. And it's not to say that everyone who asked that question, I mean, I certainly asked that question. Not everyone asked that question is asking it in an arrogant way, obviously. But you're absolutely right, Andy. When somebody's at a critical decision point, the first question, should be, okay, so why are you interested? Tell me about your interest, so on and so forth. And then as they begin to show more and more serious, disposition towards this, you then begin to talk about, okay, what are the realities of actually, needing that you need to address to actually be successful here. And I think we inadvertently, I think you're right, and we screen out a lot of people. And however, I want to connect this to admissions actually, because Laura, did you want to jump in?
I was gonna say I had this experience where I had a student of color and I wanted to admit them, and I admitted them to the PhD program. The quant score on his GMAT was relatively low, but I kind of thought I'm going to give him a chance, and really worked with him, tried to get him. He couldn't pass the classes. So we kind of have this thing where we do need them to get those skills. That's why I really like what you're doing, Peter, because I think it does help. You got to get them in, but you also, they have to have the training. It's like when I went to school and I wasn't prepared, I couldn't perform, I couldn't keep up. When I got what I needed, boom, you couldn't stop me. And so I think that's the thing, is like, we have to make sure, bring them in, but also give them the support and make sure they get those tools, because we can't bring them in without the tools. They're not going to succeed. So it's kind of a fine line there.
Absolutely. And my experience, Laura, is similar to yours. I mean, in that the students, I've had students who come to me and enter the PhD Excellence Initiative, and the first thing they have to do in their first semester with me at NYU is take Calc 1. But you know what? They take Calc 1, next semester they take Calc 2, they take Calc 3, they can do it. And I know they can do it because they've gotten into PhD programs, they pass their qualifying exams. But it's Andy's point. If you say, oh, forget it, you haven't taken calc, you haven't taken functional analysis yet, right? If that's the way you start the conversation, then you're screening out Pietro's talented future scholars who could do it if you just encourage them. But again, it's important you encourage them, and then you say, okay, all right, now here are the 4 things we have to do to sort of get you where you need to go.
One thing, just to jump in here, I know, move on. Wow, that's a great point, Peter. That's why you need to get earlier on and create and the assignment, if you want to stay it that way, for all that are currently, all of us now that are currently in the field, and what the role that everyone can play is said, hey, you want to get a PhD in finance, realize it's much less about how good you are at time value of money, but how good you are at other things to prepare you. And if we get that conversation from an internal mentor, someone else, early enough, you can say, hey, those electives you have, rather than doing these things, maybe you should think about taking calculus and taking those to prepare you to go into Pietro's program, to be good at that. And saying you need to take these courses is going to be better received by someone locally than someone that you walk up to a booth and they go, you didn't take, whoa, you can't, you haven't taken differential equations. Well, we got a problem here. And that's why it's so important to go early enough for them to correct or prepare to take advantage of the opportunities that through the pre-doc program and all these other programs that are available. I think that's why it's so important to do that, because if you don't find out till after you graduate, then there's a lot of preparation to do, and that becomes a serious constraint that many are not willing to overcome or can't. So I think those are fantastic points.
So you all mentioned different stages in the pipeline. I just want to add another set of questions that we're seeing in the chat, and that is, are these kind of stages early enough? High school, in order to think about having people who are sufficiently prepared in undergrad. I mean, is that where we need to go? How do we think about that?
I do think that at some point, if I can just speak, we have actually to go down that path. One of the things that struck me actually, was exactly that in high school, finance and economics is not taught to start with. So students have no idea what the research, they may know what the research in physical sciences are, right? So, or chemistry or biology. And so maybe those are the type of research areas they think of going to, after they graduate. They have absolutely no idea how to, what even economics and finance is. And so a number of schools are reaching out with, summer schools for students, exactly to also instruct, tell them, what the research in economics and finance is for their high school component. One of the things that I wanted to mention, so the pipeline has to actually start moving backward even farther. Going back to the skill set, just as an experience that we had, a number of students who are doing pre-doc, one is, they exploit those 2 years exactly to do what Peter and Laura have said, which is, increase also their knowledge of mathematics. So a number of students, because they are staff, they can take classes at the university, for instance, take additional analysis, other calculus, and besides the training in computer science, etc., they take on the job. So, these additional couple of years increase their human capital, so, in order to be competitive further down the road. So it's a good possibility for them.
So I wonder, in all of these initiatives, we have many of them kind of happening independently, some collaboration, but maybe not as much. Do you see opportunities to collaborate, either the groups that we're mentioning, or I know the working group that Rohan is chairing has had some contact with Effect that's working on issues related to gender in the profession. Are there kind of common themes that we can kind of take to mobilize and start working kind of on diversity more general within the profession?
I think that's crucial. Sorry to jump in immediately, even if I just talk, but I think that's so important. One of the things that not only for pre-doc, but more generally, there are so many other programs. It's important that every possible venue actually advertises. There is the Leadership Alliance program. These are a research assistantship for undergraduates that during summer. It's a fantastic program. I'm a big supporter for Leadership Alliance. Then there is the Wharton Ideas program, which is informational programs for underrepresented minorities about what is research in finance and economics. And there are so many, there are summer schools that, the more information we give around it, the more we cooperate, the better it's going to be. One of the biggest hurdle is to reach out to them. That has been for us a main priority, to reach out to the the minority serving institutions, HBCUs, etc., and really connect with their faculty in order to give them information. That is so important, because at the end of the day, it's going to be the faculty talking to the students and potentially convince them that that's a possible career, right? Than going to I don't know, Amazon or Goldman Sachs or things like that. So to me, it's really, really important to connect at the college level, at that level.
Go ahead.
Real quick, I just wanted to say that a lot of times underrepresented and students from first generations, they aren't going to understand that PhD programs are fully funded. That's something else. As a faculty member, you may not realize that's a big thing to tell them is, look, they'll pay for you to go to school and they'll give you a salary. And to know that, with a lot of these kids, they're working second jobs and just trying to get through college, to know that they can go to a PhD program funded, I think is information is really important. And that's what's lacking with kids who come from underrepresented backgrounds.
In addition to some of these organizations, and Pietro made some great suggestions there, may I commend that one thing we might do is try to look at what some of our peer associations in other disciplines outside of economics and finance that have gained a lot more traction than we have, to try to learn from them. I've mentioned this to the AFA executive. I guess now I'm on the board, so there's no excuses. But the American Marketing Association, the Academy of Management, the AAA, the American Accounting Association, they've made some really big inroads in terms of building out their pipeline. It feels like they've been thinking about these issues just a little bit more and a little bit longer, and they've gained a lot more traction. And there's probably a lot we could learn by aligning ourselves with them and some of their creative enterprises at their programs and so on. I guess implicitly, this is a recommendation to Rohan, Laura, and Heather and your committee, as you may be the right people to connect with those groups as well.
I was going to jump in that those absolutely are some of the discussions that we've had, how to reach out to other groups, not just within business and economics, but also STEM-related fields like engineering fields that have been working at this for a while, have gotten some success. And it's interesting that the barrier to all of them is what Laura brought up before, this idea of math and science and those quantitative skills that should be developed. And the whole question that Heather asked before, being engaged and connected with one another, I think this panel is important to make sure that we're touching different ways, because there's, as we talked about earlier, there's no one magic solution here. There's a lot of small pieces and different places for us to reach to, and that's a part of our thinking. And how can we best do that? And to draw in partnership with other organizations, we're trying to engage with the AEA and some of their summer programs, for instance, and another outside of economics and finance. And how are you doing it? What's successful? And I think that's really important for us to do. And those, and you know, we this has been repeated by Peter and otherwise. We just need to get the pipeline going. And right now we're not searching for 100 people. It's a lot fewer than that. And then that will start making a change in those percentages. And once we develop more and we engage in it in a more deliberate way, I think that is absolutely possible. And it's a necessity for us to try to take care of this.
You might also think about, I'm sorry, Peter.
Go ahead, Andy, go ahead.
I just wanted to go another angle, which is there are a number of corporates who are very actively interested in advancing this. In fact, not just corporate, not-for-profits. I'm thinking of the Aspen Institute's Business and Society program. They are very active. I've been fortunate to have done some work with them, and they are very much interested in advancing this with respect to the finance track, our own finance track, because they recognize the importance and the need, as well as the corporates. I mean, these corporates, like the ones I mentioned that are currently sponsored or past sponsors of the PhD project, they have an active interest in seeing us advance this, and maybe they could be catalysts to the next step as well. I mean, I'm just leaning into Heather's question, which is which groups out there beyond those that we've talked about would be the natural ones with which to ally ourselves to take the next step. And we have allies out there that want us to succeed out there. So go ahead, Peter. Sorry, pass to you.
No, that's right. Heather, if I may, just this is kind of a within the profession point, but I do think it's low-hanging fruit. And Rohan already mentioned it, but I think it's worth just emphasizing because it connects to something that Andy said earlier. So the AEA summer program, I just think, is an enormous opportunity for the American Finance Association to raise awareness of financial economics with underrepresented minority groups. So I think in this case, it's very tangibly the AFA sending or a representative, when we do things in person again, or even if it's on Zoom again this summer, putting somebody from the AFA, whether it's the president of the AFA or their chosen proxy, in front of those students in a research session to talk about what is financial economics, how it connects to issues that a student who's interested in economics cares about. Because I just think that there's this program out there where they've got sort of 40 students a year that are coming through this program. And I think the awareness of financial economics generally is quite low. I think particularly so amongst underrepresented minority students.
You're on mute, Heather.
There's certainly places for us to connect. Thank you. I want to shift during this last part of the discussion to think a bit about research and in particular, the potential for inspiring new areas of research. I want to read a question from the Q&A that comes across from Anat, where in line with Andrew's statement that maybe the enemy is we, she mentions that part of the problem is perhaps the narrowness in finance and economics that might exclude a set of topics that a broader set of applicants might be interested in. And so some of the question is about, would breaking silos help the pipeline, and might it be accompanied by changes in the program? That one's a tough one. So maybe I'll ask a question along those lines.
I can jump in.
Not a tough one, actually. Go ahead,
so
Peter.
I think the answer is yes. And I think it's a particularly relevant question you ask, Heather, for the AFA, right? Because when you think about finance, right? Most people think of finance, they think of bankers, they think of high-tech trading instruments. They think of, a fairly narrow profession being done by white guys in dark suits, right? And so if you're trying to attract a more diverse set of people to this profession, then I think it's very important that you actually signal very strongly, no, actually, finance is a much broader field than that. And there's lots of ways to apply finance to questions that are of broad interest to people who are interested in studying economics. And this is not to presume that all underrepresented minorities who study economics want to study issues affecting specifically underrepresented people, right? But the wider you can make that research funnel, the better chance you have of getting people in there. And I do think that I do think we have a bit of we've got, as Andy said, we've got a cultural problem, but I also think we've got a name because of the cultural issue. We also got a marketing issue, and it's disinformation. Finance is a broad field. It includes household finance. It includes international finance, issues related to developing countries. There's a wide range of things you can study that are actually finance that have nothing to do with leverage buyouts.
I think that's exactly right, Peter. It's broadening the tent of topics is something that that we just need to keep our eye on. This may be a little bit self-serving, but I'll talk about the fact that we tried to open up new topics when I was at the RFS in terms of pursuing fintech and a push for fintech, which seems like part of our common vernacular today, but 4 years ago, just go look. There were no papers on the topic, hardly any in the top journals in finance, let alone in climate finance, where we kicked that off. And the reason was very simple. There seemed to be a penchant, primarily among younger people in our profession, that they were chomping at the bit at these broader topics than the ones that had already been trodden on before. And I really believe that opening up and showing ourselves to be much more open-minded about the kinds of topics that are legitimately within the field of finance are going to put us in better standing in terms of broadening those that might be interested and diversifying our profession more broadly. It's something we can do.
I just to add to that, I think when you in general say, well, we think about finances, asset pricing or corporate finance, and that's kind of it. But as both of you mentioned, you talk about household finance and ESG related issues. The field is quite broad, but it seems like it's very, very focused. And we have this fence, like, you guys stay out because this is sort of what we do. But I think we do have a cultural and a marketing issue, because when you look inside the journals, and some of which Andrew engaged, you do see topics that are very, very broad, but it is presented in a way externally as these are the two focused things that areas we work in. But I think it's broader, it's broadening, and it will continue to be broader, and we should embrace that, and maybe spend time advertising that finance touches a lot of things within the firm and society in general that are quite important in solving broader societal issues. And it'll make it much more attractive to a lot more people. And just, I wanted to highlight another point Peter made here is this idea of getting diversity in the field is all about diversity of thought, right? And people from different backgrounds approach the same problem in very different ways. And that's the huge value to the field at large. And that's why a diverse set of faculty members and corporations have figured that out. That's why we get this. I think it's so important for us to deal with.
I forgot just one more thing. I think that this is an appeal to the leadership of, I guess, the finance profession, right? So basically, what really determines what gets considered to be, to use Andy's point, in the tent versus outside of the tent, is what gets published in the journals. So journal editors have a very important role to play. You talk about implicit bias. If there's implicit bias anywhere, or vert bias, it's in the editing and refereeing process, right? And so there's this notion somehow, we talk about asset pricing versus corporate finance. If we can't identify it as squarely one of those two buckets, we get nervous, right? We get nervous. So we're lowering the standards or something, right? I think we have to learn to be, how should I put it, more intellectually confident, in the sense that we're going to judge questions on their merit as opposed to by their stripe. And I think that sounds kind of abstract, but I think that approach from an editorial perspective, and what does that mean tangibly? I think it means just editors got to think more broadly about who do you ask to referee papers, right? If you're always asking the same, 37 guys, you're gonna roughly get the same, broadly speaking, looking journal year after year. So I don't have an answer, but I think that's the right question to ask. And you don't have to lower standards to do it.
Pietro, I didn't want to interrupt you, but
no,
if
I was going to echo, both points about the differences in research approach. I always thought that was going to be an issue. Actually, I wrote a paper right now. It just came out this morning on the MBR working paper, exactly on the point of refereeing. It's a theory paper, but it shows how these two type of biases in the output, and not biases of people, even if people are completely, for instance, gender neutral or any neutrality in applying their standards. However, if you start with a population that is skewed in one direction, and so they apply always their way of thinking, that's exactly what Peter just said, to evaluate other people's work, then you keep screaming out all the innovative new ideas that came out could broaden the field. And so that is a total loss to society. Absolutely. I couldn't agree more with that. And we have a theorem about that unless we do changes. I will send it to all of you. But what you were saying, I couldn't just see it, my model, into your words.
The Veronesi theorem.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. So I want to ask a little bit more about what we can do. There was a question in the chat. We talked about kind of our colleagues. There was a question in the chat about PhD students, maybe kind of how can they help with increasing diversity in the fields.
Well, Andrew, if you want to talk, you can go ahead. But
No, I was just going to say that they, in my experience, and like Laura, before I did these current jobs, I ran the PhD program in finance at Ohio State for 10 years. My most reliable agents out there for recruiting were as much my fellow faculty as they were the PhD students that were in the program. They were so critically important because it was much more likely to be unstructured discussion, less formalism in the kinds of conversations that would take place towards trying to attract a student to a program. So what I would say is leveraging PhD students that are currently in the programs as agents for those prospective students that you may seek out, those students that come from different backgrounds, not traditional backgrounds. Seeing those that are in the program that have also come from different kinds of backgrounds and that they can succeed. You know, it's this role model theory that we were talking about earlier in the session, I think can be so critically important. What I would say is to any PhD student out there listening to us right now, that if you have an idea of some candidate that might be potential, that you give them the link immediately to predoc.org or phdproject.org and encourage them to sign up, to explore their interest further at the next stage. You can be an important agent of change in a small, what seems like a small way, but can be a very effective way. Go ahead, Pietro.
I wanted to be a little also more forthcoming, going back to the implicit bias and things of the kind. I completely agree with Andrew. I ran the PhD program for a while at Booth, and 100% agree with Andrew. You know, PhDs are really important. But going back to the hiring part or selecting students, I think we as institutions should be a little more proactive on having programs that our faculty can go through. You know, I don't know if we're making mandatory or not. You know, these things will depend on each institution. But I did follow and went to a number of implicit bias type of programs that University of Chicago is running, and they are incredibly inspiring. You know, it tells you a lot of things that you don't realize. That's the problem. That, you know, I never thought that I could have any bias because, you know, the way I think. But then, you know, you're confronted with these things that are in the back of your mind that you never even thought that they were there. And they are really useful. And so, you know, we are trying, at least locally, to have these programs for our faculty to attend to. You know, there could be videos or could be just somebody talking to them, etc. I think that if the AFA, going back to, you know, the new committee can, you know, maybe encourage, you know, the various institutions to do a number of these programs for, you know, implicit bias and how to deal with those things that, you know, Rohan was talking about before, I think will be already a step forward, because I don't think all of us actually are aware even that we have these biases.
Heather, can I make a point on admission about that related to admissions?
Yes, please.
So I'd like to suggest the following experiment for admissions departments to try, and then I'll explain why I think they should do it. So I would suggest that PhD admissions programs do the following thing. So as a faculty person who's in charge of it, have an administrator be in charge of basically determining every applicant who crosses a basic threshold. Okay, and that basic threshold, I don't know exactly where it should be, but I'm pretty sure that, you know, getting in the 99th percentile on the quantitative part of the GRE is not the right threshold, because we know, I mean, because we went to graduate school with a lot of them, people who kept perfect GRE scores and bombed out of the PhD program because they had no intellectual curiosity or grit. So that's clearly not the right mechanism. I would suggest that the threshold is, and again, the difference between getting a 99th percentile score on the GRE quantitative section and 85th percentile is like 2 or 3 questions. And do we really think this is the determinative? So what I would suggest is have an administrator figure out, come up with some threshold, and the threshold should be high enough so that we believe that people who score above, if you can, for instance, if you can score above, I don't know, a combined, 80th percentile on both sections of the GRE, you clearly have the quantitative and verbal reasoning skills if you have the grit and curiosity to get through a program. I made that number up, right? But you could, so once you figure out who crosses that threshold, right? We no longer allow people to look at test scores. We got to just do the hard work of actually reading the essays, looking at their background, and figuring out who really has what it takes to do a PhD, who really wants to do a PhD. And the reason why I think that's so important, I think there are 2 reasons why it's really important. Number one, the marginal benefit of getting one more question right or 2 questions right on the math part of the GRE, I think is pretty marginal. And we know that sort of who tends to fall into that 99th percentile bucket. Of course, it's highly correlated with life advantage. So you're basically, you're screening out a bunch of people. Again, it's Pietro's pointed out talent who could do this program, right? But because you've imposed kind of this, you've imposed a heuristic that really serves the following purpose. And what that heuristic does is it makes us feel very comfortable if we get it wrong, right? So in other words, we know from experience, there are a bunch of people who go to PhD programs who score in the 99th percentile on their math score, and they fail out or they don't finish. But no one feels badly about that because like, oh, well, they had a 99th percentile score in the GRE. And so we don't worry about the other question, which is, well, who are the people that we didn't let in erroneously because they didn't score high enough, who actually would have been better PhD students than the people who scored in the 99th percentile, right? So I'm not saying eliminate standards. I'm not even saying lower the standards. I'm just saying change the way you think about talent, because actually what it is we're trying to identify are what Jerry Hausman taught me in graduate school are unobserved fixed effects. And the ability of the GRE to sort of to identify that fixed effect between an 85th percentile math score and a 99th percentile score, it's inframarginal. It's in the cases it's spurious. But again, I'm not saying lower the standards, because to Laura's earlier point, you've got to be able to do analytical geometry and calculus and certain things to succeed in graduate school. But I submit anybody who can score 85th percentile on the quantitative part of the GRE and has taken linear algebra and some other courses, they can do it. They can figure it out. But we're lazy and we're risk averse. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Peter. So this is really kind of public brainstorming, lots of experiments that those who are kind of committed to making some progress here can certainly pursue. We have about 5 minutes left, which means that we have time maybe for a very quick go round. We'll go around to the panelists, and you can give me maybe about 30 seconds on the biggest takeaway. What would you like kind of an AFA member to take from our conversation today? And I'll just go in a circle in the way that you show up on my screen. So this time I'll start with Rohan.
I think a good takeaway for the average AFA member is to think about the problem we're facing and realize that they can do something about it by becoming a mentor or paying attention to students and thinking about how to prepare students for this career, and being more open-minded, as we talked about, and presenting what the field is all about. And earlier in the student's career, then identify those and provide some advice for pathways to, I think, is a fantastic career, what they should be doing now, how they should prepare for this as an opportunity, and just be open to the possibility that he or she does not have to necessarily look like you, but just be open-minded to be willing to do so.
Great. Thanks, Rohan. Laura?
So I think a lot of us get in a mindset where we have to publish and all we think about is research. But I think if we just step back a little and recognize we have all this ability to really affect the whole future of a student just by getting to know them and giving them a little bit of encouragement. I think I would say that that's what I would like the average AFA member to come away with, is you can really have a huge impact on a student and their entire whole life and generations after that even.
Great, thank you. Pietro?
I would second what Laura and Rohan have just said, in the following sense, as we just said, the issue is the pipeline essentially starts very early. So if you're an FA member, you teach undergraduates, inspire them when they are freshmen, they are taking the first classes, tell them what is it research, it's something really, really interesting to do, and inspire them to do it. As Laura said, you can actually change the life of a lot of people, and it feels good.
Great, thank you. Peter?
So I would say if you want to change the life of a student, please send them to www.phdexcellence.org.
Great, thank you. And Andrew?
The next time you have the occasion to meet with somebody who comes from an underrepresented background, who expresses an iota of interest in pursuing PhD studies in finance, engage them, ask them why, let them talk, listen, talk less, listen more. And then when it comes time to making some concrete recommendation, encourage them to reach out to the phdproject.org, predoc.org, Peter's organization. Let them explore their interests. I suppose another thing would be, a second thing would be, if you're an AFA member and you have an active engagement with a corporate out there who cares about these issues, about diversifying the academy, and particularly with respect to the finance profession. Mention that you had this conversation. You listened to this conversation at this first ever panel on race in the finance profession at the AFA meetings, and they were talking about the ways in which they need to build out their pool. And gosh, if you're really interested, why don't you put some sponsorship money, behind your mouth? Put your money where your mouth is, and maybe go off and support some of these organizations. The Sloan Foundation's initiative that Peter was talking about, become a sponsor for the PhD project. Maybe underwrite some of these, if you're an organization, underwrite some of the pre-doc initiatives of that Pietro's involved with. Maybe there are other interesting and creative ways to do things too. That's my two suggestions. Thanks, by the way, Heather, for doing a great job. And thank you to the fellow panelists. It was just fabulous to listen to.
Yeah, great job, Heather.
Great. Yeah. Thanks so much to all of you, and to all of you for attending. Lots of great ideas, lots of great work, and hopefully our conversation will inspire even more. So thank you. Take care, everyone.
Happy New Year.
Bye-bye.
Happy New Year, everybody. Thank you.